that a lot of my students are here. So I'm teaching History 163, which is Modern Central Asia. I teach it every spring. And I've got probably the best group I've ever had teaching that course this semester. And they're all here. They've got their cameras off, but they're here. So I've been letting them know about how much I admire you and just what a really interesting kind of niche you've kind of carved out for yourself in terms of this really important group that is spanning the Sino-Soviet divide and the kind of really untold story of what happened to the Hui, the Dungans, west of that divide. You know, the Dungans are a big deal in China, but still, you know, even in Central Asian studies, people don't talk about this a lot. And folklore, of course, is something that was very important in Soviet academia, but it hasn't gotten its due, I think. Russian studies, Soviet studies, Central Asian studies in the West, in part because it's been so focused on this really dry political stuff. So I just admire what you're doing on so many different levels. It's so important. And I'd like to go ahead, actually, before I forget, Kenneth, I'm going to make you a co-host. So, because you have slides you want to share, right?
Yes. Yes.
So let me do that. And it is my pleasure to introduce Kenneth Yin, who teaches modern languages, literatures, and linguistics at the City University of New York. His scholarly work focuses on the Dungan literature and culture of Central Asia, though he's also interested in Siberian Tungus literatures. He studied at Cornell and Georgetown, and he's received fellowships and awards from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, as well as his home institution, now the City University of New York. His book publications include Dungan Folk Tales and Legends, which is heavy enough to be a murder weapon and also one of the most beautiful books, which has the distinction of being a book I don't keep in my office. I keep this one at home, actually, which is my own way of honoring it, as well as the book he's talking about today, Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon. So Kenneth, it's such a delight to have you back, and we're all looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. After my presentation in fall of 2022 about the Dungan folktales and legends. And I also want to thank all of the great people with the Central Asia Working Group at UNC-Chapel Hill for hosting the talk today. Okay, so yeah, so I will be talking about my recently published book, Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan Ethnographer Ali Dzhon. It was published by Peter Lang last January of 2023. So I'm going to share the slides here. Okay, so do share screen. There we go. Can everybody see the slides?
It says that it started, so maybe we just need to give it a second.
Oh, okay, I see.
To work.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So this was a project that I worked on for quite a few years. I began when I first made contact with Ali Dzhon, who is currently in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, in 2015. And I was able to obtain I realized that this very well-known Dungan ethnographer had actually also been producing creative writings for quite some time, and actually had published by that time 2 editions of his poetry, and had also published some of his short fiction. And I was absolutely just taken with it, and especially when I read the creative writings, and I felt that I needed to bring it to a larger audience. And that's where the idea of this annotated English translation came from. Yeah. Um, can everybody see the slides now? Yes?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. For some reason, it's not. Oh, from the beginning, that's what I should do. Okay. Yeah. So I have the talk today broken up into roughly 4 parts of sort of differing length. What I would like to do first is provide a brief introduction to the Dungan people. So the descendants of the Dungans are the Hui people, or the Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims. And they are an ethno-religious group predominantly distributed throughout China, and they number approximately 10.5 million, according to the 2011 Chinese census. As you can see on the map here, they are mainly in the northwestern provinces and the central plain, or Zhongyuan. The Hui are one of 56 ethnic groups officially recognized by the People's Republic of China, which defines the Hui to include all historically Muslim communities not included in China's other ethnic groups. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dungan or Hui migrations from Northwest China to Central Asia. So the first occurred in the winter of 1877 to 1878 in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877. It is also known as the Tongzhi Hui Revolt or Hui Minorities War. The next wave of migration was from 1881 to 1884, and this was following the signing of this Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, which restored to China the Upper Ili Basin, which had been occupied by Russian troops since 1871 during the Dungan Revolt. And then third, and less well documented, was a wave of migration in the first part of the 20th century until the border between the Soviet Union and China was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine, lasting roughly from 1959 to 1961. So most of the original Dungan settlers were poor, illiterate peasants or small urban craftsmen who came from Gansu province, Shanxi province, and Xinjiang in China. In terms of the numbers, the latest census data available as of 2020 indicate that there are an estimated 150,000 Dungans. The Dungans live primarily, as you can see on the map here, in the following 3 regions: Kyrgyzstan, where there are slightly over 70,000, according to the 2020 Kyrgyz census. Kazakhstan, almost about the same number, slightly over 70,000, according to the 2019 Kazakh census. And then approximately 3,000 in Uzbekistan. And this is 2009 estimates of the Dungan Cultural Center of Uzbekistan. And it's interesting to note that more recently, beginning only in 2000, there's been a growing migration of Dungans from Central Asia to Saratov Oblast, which is located in the southeast of European Russia. And there were slightly over 1,600 Dungans in Saratov Oblast counted in the 2010 Russian census. So by tradition, the Dungans are Sunni Muslims of the Hanafi school, like most of their Central Asian neighbors. And the Dungans have traditionally had large families, often with between 6 and 8 children, and they enjoy a reputation as a hardworking and prosperous people. And most of these comments come from Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer. So now I'd like to make a few comments about Ali Dzhon. So Dzhon holds the rank of senior researcher in the Dungan and Chinese Studies Center of the National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. He holds an honorary title as Honored Worker of Science of the National Academy of Sciences of the Kyrgyz Republic. In addition to the traditional research work he's been engaged in as an ethnographer since 1978, Dzhon began pursuing creative literary modes of expression in 1969, while he was a student of literature at the Przhevalsky State Pedagogical Institute in the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. Dzhon's creative writing is rooted in his experiences as an ethnic Dungan in Central Asia during the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. So in addition to 2 published volumes of original Russian language poetry, which I already mentioned, Dzhon has published more than 50 scholarly monographs and articles in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Japan. Dzhon's works in Chinese translation appear under his Chinese name, which I think you might have seen on the earlier slide, Zhang Erli. Okay. Here are some photographs of Dzhon, which appear also in the book Mystical Forest. This is a family photo that was taken in 1973. In the front row, you see Dzhon on the far right. Next to second is his mother, who is actually an ethnic Russian. And then next to her is Dzhon's father. Then there's also an interesting picture of Dzhon with his younger brother, Vianney Amin, that was taken in 1974 when they were back home during their service in the Soviet army. You can see that on the lapels, Svetskaya Armia there. And then finally, this is a photo of Dzhon in 1981 with Dungan Friends and National Poets of Kyrgyzstan during a birthday celebration for the ethnic Dungan poet Yasir Shivaza, who is in the middle, in the first row. And then the other national poets of Kyrgyzstan in the front row, who you may recognize. On the left is Ali Tokambayev, who wrote under the pseudonym Balka. And on the far right, in the first row, is Musa Zhaganziev. And Dzhon, of course, is in the back row. He's the third from the left. So if you go to the book, Mystical Forest, you'll see some other photos which came from Dzhon's personal archives. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about the theoretical framework for the study of Dzhon's ethnographic poetry and narrative. So the first is native ethnography. As a branch of anthropology, ethnography is considered with the systematic study of individual cultures, mostly using participant observation. So Dzhon stands out as the native ethnographer, that is, an ethnic Dungan studying his own people, when the classic ethnographic paradigm has been that of the non-native ethnographer or someone on the outside looking in. Next, I would like to speak about the relevance to literary anthropology or anthropological poetics of this collection. So Dzhon's literary works are examples of literary anthropology or anthropological poetics. The development of literary anthropology gained momentum relatively recently in the 1980s, but it originated in the pioneering work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who you see on the slide, whose work on kinship structures in the 1940s and whose study of myth turned the attention of anthropologists to the important and neglected dimension of language. Since the mid-1980s, anthropology has become more open to literary theory and literary forms, in particular, with ethnographic poetry thus gaining increasing acceptance as a mode of representation. This is also true for related social science fields, and there has been a proliferation of experimental approaches to ethnography since the 1990s, which has led to the increasing visibility not only of ethnographic poetry, but also of ethnographic fiction, memoirs, biography, or a pastiche of various forms. Dzhon's literary works also contribute to the field of Russophone studies, specifically the study of Russophone literature, which can be broadly defined as literature written in the Russian language by authors who do not identify as Russian, and can be considered within the broader transnational and post-colonial framework that has been rapidly emerging in Russian, East European, and Eurasian literary studies. Russophone writers like Dzhon find themselves at a distance from civic, national, or ethnic conceptions of Russianness. And this idea of Russophonia, a term that's actually been coined by Naomi Caffey, also speaks to the decolonization of Russian literature. Finally, the publication of Dzhon's collected poems and short stories in my annotated English translation represents an important contribution to Sinophone studies, as it will help to draw more global attention to the unique case presented by the Dungans in the Sinophone debate, the study of Chinese language literature, the Dungan language being a form of Mandarin Chinese. So the relation between Chinese cultural identity and the use of Chinese written characters is a frequent topic of discussion among historians of China. The Dungans represent a unique case as they have never used sinographs or Chinese characters to write their native language, yet it's well known that they have managed in diaspora to maintain their Chineseness to a very large extent. The study of Dungan cultural identity in all its aspects, including the examination of the exceedingly rich and extensive literary tradition of the Dungans, including Dzhon's literary output, offers crucial insights into the Sinophone debate. Okay. Now I'll get to the final part, which I'll spend the most time on, which is Dzhon's poetry and prose, specifically as it appears in the annotated English edition. titled Mystical Forest. So the book, as I already mentioned, was published last year. I'd just like to point out the beautiful image on the front cover was actually produced by his son, Ismar Dzhon, who is apparently a superstar of sorts in terms of graphic design in Kyrgyzstan, as far as I understand. And this actually appeared with one of his, with the Russian language edition that came out earlier, the first one. And so the book, in addition to my translations, begins with an introduction, and it's called Dzhon and His Place in the Dungan Literary World. Here I provide a brief biography of Dzhon, a subsection titled Dzhon on the title poem Mystical Forest, a message to readers from Dzhon, which I translated, and also a selected bibliography to shine some light on the really important and substantial body of scientific work that he's produced, in addition to his creative writings. So the bibliography is a list of book-length works, scholarly articles, and scholarly book contributions attributed to Dzhon based on his own reporting of his published works as of early 2022. In addition to his 2 published volumes, as I mentioned, he's published many scholarly monographs that have appeared in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, China, and Japan. So now I'd like to talk about the chapters that appear in Mystical Forest, and I will present the table of contents and make some comments about select poems. So the first, I've given sort of thematic divisions of his work so that each chapter will focus on a particular theme. Of course, there is overlap, so I had to make decisions, of course, about which was a dominant theme, so to speak. But the first chapter constitutes poems of what I call rumination. And among these is, as you see, is a poem titled February 7th, 2020. And this is the date when interethnic conflict broke out within Kordai Rayon, Kazakhstan, during the Dungan Kazakh ethnic clashes that occurred over the course of several days in early February 2020. So this, of course, is one of the later selections, and it's a very heartfelt and moving poem. Chapter 2 contains what I call poems of autobiographical nature, and he writes here about his wife, who is actually what's called Koryo Saram, or ethnic Korean, as well as several poems which mentioned or are dedicated to his 2 sons, as well as his mother, who I already mentioned is an ethnic Russian. Chapter 3, poems about family, right? So I guess some of the comments I made earlier also apply here to actually the poems about the family, right? Poems dedicated to his wife and son and mother. I think I got a little bit ahead of myself with comments there. Okay, so he dedicates several of the poems in general in the collection. Chapter 4 contains what I call poems about love. And some of them are actually quite humorous. For example, a joke of old Eros. He has a very, very sort of keen sense of humor, which I think really come through in the collection. Chapter 5 contains what I call poems of friendship. So among these is a poem called A Tree in the second column. This is a dedication to Yasir Shivaza, who I mentioned already, a national poet of Kyrgyzstan, ethnic Dungan. He lived from 1906 to 1988 and is the most celebrated poet of the Dungans. And there is actually a book about him that was written by Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer that was published by Peter Lang, I believe, in 1991, if you are interested in seeing Shivaza's poetry with commentary by Dyer. Her collection actually includes the original Dungan, and then Dyer's sort of Chinese transliterations, if you will, and then her scholarly English translations. So Shivaza was a writer of fictional prose, a linguist, a translator, and also a social activist during the Soviet period, in addition to being a great poet. Chapter 6 contains poems of what I'm calling nostalgia. These poems reference some of the places Dzhon has spent time in Russia, Kazakhstan, as well as Kyrgyzstan. Chapter 7 is Dzhon's poems of melancholy, as I have call it. These poems include an early poem of Dzhon's written in 1970, titled "Emulating Sergei Yesenin." That was one of his favorite Russian poets. Sergei Yesenin, who lived from 1895 to 1925, as many of you may know, was a famous Russian lyric poet of the Silver Age of Russian poetry. Chapter 8 contains Dzhon's poems of nationalistic character. Among these poems is one titled Unrest, which is one of the longest poems in this collection. It's a heart-wrenching piece about the first Dungan migration from Northwest China to Russian Central Asia following the suppression of the Dungan revolt in the late 19th century. Another poem that I'd like to comment on is To Dzhon Kasim. And this is a poem dedicated to Dzhon's late uncle and all the veterans of the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, as it's better known in the West. So Dzhon Kasim, the older brother of Ali Aliyevich Dzhon's father, was quite well known among the Dungans because he was a jeweler who crafted traditional pieces. In the 1930s, he became artistic director of a professional music ensemble that performed folk tunes at the Philharmonic of the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. And tragically, he went missing in action in the battles near Stalingrad in the Great Patriotic War. And I have an annotation that speaks to this in the book as well, as I do have quite a few annotations for quite a few of the other selections. And then finally, just a comment about the last poem in this chapter by Yan Hu. Hu is the best known among the anti-Qing Hui commanders to flee to Russian territory. And he's also known as Mohammed Ayub. And he was a rebel from Shanxi province who fled with several thousand of his followers following their defeat in the Dungan revolt, settling in the village of Karakunuz, present-day Masanchi, Kazakhstan, near the border with Kyrgyzstan. And the group, according to Dyer, numbered 3,314 upon arrival in the spring of 1878. The ninth and final chapter of poetry contains poems of religious character. So here I'll just point out the poem Dua. This is about the act of supplication regarded by Muslims as a profound act of worship. The poem titled Friday Prayer is about the special congregational prayer Muslims hold every Friday in the early afternoon in place of the ordinary Zuhr prayer. And the final chapter in the collection, the 10th chapter, contains 4 short stories of Dzhon's. 3 of the 4 short stories were previously published in Dungan translation in the Dungan newspaper, 10月的旗, meaning October Banner. Only the last here, Bitter Root, Gorky Korin, in Russian, has neither been published in the original Russian nor been published in the translation until now. So just a few comments about each of these 4 just really interesting prose selections. The first is about the bicycle. This is about a Dungan youth's attempt to retrieve his treasured bicycle with the events leading to important revelations of identity and self. The second short story here, Tales of Grandmother Mayan. In this particular selection, Grandmother Mayan tells her young grandson about the strange goings-on in a vacated neighborhood house that the villagers believe to be cursed, and a mysterious incident soon ensues on the manor. The story Last Song searches for the meaning behind a sad melody played by an old man on his kamuz, which some of you may know is a 3-string fretless lute used in Central Asian music. And then finally, structured as a dialogue or playlet, the 4th short story, Bitter Root, follows the life paths and mutually unanswered yearnings of an unnamed man and woman, beginning from their school-age friendship through their time as parents to growing children. So just really, really interesting and sort of varied, sort of structurally and thematically, his prose writings. And so finally, before we go to the Q&A, I would like to read to you a translation of one of the poems in my translation. And I thought I would read to you the title poem in the collection. which is called, which I'm translating as Mystical Forest. This appears on page 20 in the English edition. So there are visual aspects to many of his poems, interestingly enough. And this was actually one of the more difficult aspects of the proof reviews, in fact, to get the sort of visual sort of layout sort of correct. But I tried to show here also in this particular poem, the visual sort of patterns, which have meaning also, in addition to the text themselves. So there is a mountain forest, verdant on the slopes, and high atop are dry maples. Beasts dwell there, deep are their dens. Unicorns, too, are to be found. Jewels are hidden in the recesses of the canyons, and wayfarers make their way, sleepless and aimless. Flowers blossom like vivid carpets. Upon them dance children with innocent eyes. In dark corners, owls burst out laughing, and blackbirds peck at the hemlock. In the thicket flourish meanness and magnanimity. Together nest extravagance and penury. The lion and the rabbit share the same bed. Still there too is exceeding anguish. It roars, destroying all in its path, and gnaws at the forest called the soul. So with respect to the meaning of this title poem, Dzhon himself writes, the poem, the forest itself, is a mystery, since an individual does not know what awaits him beyond the next group of trees or in the next clearing. Thus, as I see it, the human soul, its inner world and actions are the forest and the mystery, which is at times undisclosed and incomprehensible in its motives to the individual himself. And this is just an excerpt from Dzhon's own commentary on the title poem that's included in my English language edition on page 8. So in closing, I'd just like to make a few comments on Dzhon's literary pieces, which I hope you may have a chance to see if you're able to get a hold of a copy of the book. But I'd like to mention some of the features that really stand out about Dzhon's writing. What I would mention are his lyric turns of phrase, the vividness of his descriptions, his keen wit, the humbleness of his character, his genuine candor, the intensity of his emotions, his devotion to his family, his friends, and his faith. And last but not least, his overwhelming concern for the past, the present, and the future of his native people, the Dungans of Central Asia. So I hope that readers of Mystical Forest, the English language edition of Dzhon's works, will go away with a better understanding of Dzhon as a multifaceted individual who is at once the most important ethnographer of the Dungans and a masterful poet and fictional prose writer. For further information about any of my work on the Dungans, please visit my professional website on Georgetown Domains at kjy.georgetown.domains. And I look forward to hearing any questions or comments that you may have if you're able to stay for the Q&A segment now. And thank you all very much for your attention.
Kenneth, thanks so much for a great presentation. And I already see that Isaac has a question. Thank you, Isaac, for usually there's an awkward silence. So thanks very much for asking the first question. I believe
Absolutely. I apologize if it's a bit
I don't need to
loud.
unmute you. Okay, great.
No, all is good. Kenneth, thank you so much again. I apologize for the noise. One of the things I'm curious about, and I feel like we've always talked about in history and in literature and writing, is bias. And so essentially, let me lower my hands. Is essentially bias in authors' writings. And so here we have someone that is a Dungan himself writing about his own people. And so we might initially think to ourselves, well, that's great because you're able to have more perspectives than you would otherwise. And you're able to kind of have this insight that an outsider might not. I'm curious if you think there are drawbacks from that and something that perhaps an outsider wouldn't be biased and affected by that might persuade or that might shift some of Dzhon's writing into something that maybe is only perceived from an insider, but from a more unbiased perspective or just from a removed perspective, we don't necessarily see.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I guess this speaks to perhaps the fact that Dzhon's writing ultimately has to be understood within this framework of Russophonia, if you will, or Russophone writing. So yeah, it's very interesting because Dzhon, like many of his contemporaries, is an ethnic Dungan, but his primary language and the only language that he actually writes in is in fact Russian. So you're right that it's an interesting sort of situation. And as an ethnographer as well, he is sort of also, as I mentioned, sort of unusual in the sense that he's sort of an insider, an ethnic Dungan writing about his own people, whereas the traditional ethnographic paradigm is somebody looking in sort of from the outside. So yeah, that's very interesting there. So yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, I think it's extremely valuable what the perspective that he has in the sense that he is, you know, ethnically Dungan and writing about the Dungans, but also this added aspect though of writing in Russian. And if you get to see the book, you will see that there is a strong influence also of Russian writers on Dzhon's own creative output. You will definitely see that. I already mentioned Yesenin, for example. So yeah, that's extremely I mean, I think the second part of your question was about perhaps other people who would be writing about the Dungans as well. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's also extremely would be extremely valuable and extremely informative as well. And from, you know, looking at it again, sort of from a different perspective, you know, whether it's, you know, particularly with the ethnographic work, let's say, and there actually are some non-Dungan ethnographers now who are doing work on the Dungans. One of them is Soledad Jimenez Tovar. She's actually a professor in Mexico. I actually have her mentioned on my webpage about the Dungans on my website, if you're interested in knowing more about her. And Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer, she's not an ethnographer per se, but she's not a Dungan. She was actually part of the Russian Jewish emigre community that ended up in Shanghai, China, in the early 20th century, and then she ended up in Australia and then coming to the US for her graduate studies in linguistics, which was at Georgetown Chinese Linguistics, and then went back to Australia to finish up her PhD work, and she's been working from there. But she's been writing, of course, in English more about that. And I also have references to her on my page for Dungan studies. Yeah. But I think it's all very valuable. Yes, everybody who's sort of doing the this work on the Dungan from the various perspectives. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Isaac, for the question.
Thanks, Kenneth. And I think Paige had her hand up next.
Hi, I just had a question regarding something you said. I think it was when you were talking about Sinophone studies and how Chinese character was like specifically like a part of identity, and you mentioned that the Dungans don't use the Chinese character. So I was wondering like how language, like the history of language with those peoples, like did they speak Chinese and not write in character, and like now like what language do they speak, and like just kind of like more clarification on language from, you know, those peoples. Yeah.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Paige. Yeah, so it's an extremely interesting and unique case with the Dungans, in that the language that they brought over from China to Russian Central Asia in the late 19th century with the first migrations was a form of Mandarin Chinese having several like major dialects. Most linguists break it up into 7 major dialect groups, so Mandarin being one of those. But even within those dialect groups, there are numerous subdialects. So for Mandarin, there is what's called Beijing Mandarin, for example, which is what most people would learn outside of China, like Chinese as a second language. That would be modern standard Chinese. That would be Beijing Mandarin, right? So the Dungans and their ancestors do not speak that. They speak a subdialect of Mandarin, right? And it's actually, depending on who you're speaking with, it's only intelligible, mutually intelligible to a certain degree, meaning a standard Chinese, that's called, or Beijing Mandarin, versus the Dungan sort of a subdialect of Mandarin, which is now, you know, the Dungan language, correct? But then also the Dungan language itself also developed 2 major dialects, a Shanxi a dialect, if you will, and then a Gansu dialect, reflecting where they settled, right? So the Gansu dialect being spoken primarily in Kyrgyzstan, where people from Gansu came from, and the Shanxi dialect in Kazakhstan. And there are also differences in pronunciation and whatnot between those subdialects. But in terms of the written language, you know, in part because many of the first settlers were actually illiterate themselves, right? They were, as I mentioned, like the farmers or petty traders. There wasn't really a written form that these Dungans use for their native language from the times of their first migration, like in the winter of 1877, 1878, until the Soviet period, until the Soviets sort of were assigning, if you will, or helping these minority peoples, not just the Dungans, to create alphabets for their language. And the Dungans also went through those sort of same stages where in the 1920s there was experimentation with a Latin alphabet, and there were several versions of that. Part of the reason also being because the Latin alphabet that was designed in Central Asia in a lot of ways was suited more in terms of sound, phonologically, the Turkic languages, which is what most of the languages, were in Central Asia. So it had to be quite a bit modified, but eventually that it was scrapped in favor of a modified Cyrillic alphabet for the Dungans. Yeah. And that took place actually after the war. Was delayed a bit by the war. Yeah. So in terms of the Sinophone sort of study, so it's just very interesting because even though, for example, Dzhon, he doesn't write in Dungan per se, he still has oral sort of a facility with Dungan. So it's still part of this Sinophone debate, so to speak, about how, this the language, but not just the language, also the culture and the Chineseness, which the Dungans have really preserved to really a very, very large extent, which is quite surprising considering that they've really been, on Central Asian soil now for more than 140 years. How that can be understood in the larger Sinophone debate is something that really hasn't been explored very much, as you can imagine. And part of that is because most of the scholars writing about this Sinophonia or Sinophone debate are in fact scholars of China. And they do not necessarily, most of them would not have facility with Russian, for example, to be able to include the Dungans in this discussion. So that's one of the things, one of the scholarly audiences that I hope to be able to appeal to with my English language editions of these works, not just with this, but also with folk tales and other ongoing projects with the Dungans. Yeah.
I believe
Thank
Tucker had his
you.
hand up next.
Hello. Thank you so much for talking to us today. It was super interesting, and it was awesome to hear what you had to say and what you're working on. My question is kind of similar, and relates to basically like looking at like the Dungan people and region in kind of in between like a Russophone and Sinophone kind of like conversation or debate. And like just wondering how like the use of like the Russian language in Dzhon's work or like the migrations from Northwest China to Russia in terms of like political, social identity, religious identity, cultural identity, as well as kind of like relation to like the physical geography of their like homeland. I know that's kind of a lot, but does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. Yeah, thank you so much, Tucker, for that great question. Yeah, I mean there's a lot to talk about there. And yeah, so again, it's just so absolutely fascinating, I think, the examination of Dungan literature, Dungan culture, for what it really does say in terms of both Russophonia as well as Sinophone studies, right? And yeah, this whole and also, yes, absolutely. I think it absolutely sort of offers um so much sort of food for thought in terms of, how does all of that go to create Dungan identity, correct? In Central Asia, right? Um, Considering, including politics, social aspects and cultural sort of aspects, as you mentioned. Um, and I don't know, you might be, it makes me think now about the earlier sort of English edition that I put out in 2021 about the Dungan folk tales and legends. And that talks a lot about the various sort of influences, on the Dungan folk literature, formation sort of Dungan identity in terms of, for example, Islamic sort of elements, Central Asian elements, Chinese elements, correct? But absolutely also what you mentioned, the need to consider the physical geography, their actual, location within Central Asia is also absolutely critically important. And, as much as the Dungans have preserved much of their Chineseness, in the more than 140 years since the first wave of migration from Northwest China to what was then Russian Central Asia, they are also very much a part of the Central Asian fabric. And yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know, I'm actually working on currently on other book projects, translation projects. One of them actually is a documentary novel about the best known Soviet Dungan prose writer, Arli Arbudu. And it makes me think about that, your sort of question, because that really documents the sort of Soviet period, and in terms of the formation sort of the Dungan sort of identity through the eyes of one of their elite, if you will, their intelligentsia, right? But you see the wider picture as well, and the impact of their sort of being, being one of the Central Asian minorities. You see that there as well, how they sort of fit in there. So yeah, but yeah, there's so much. There's just so much there to think about and to ponder. And those are the kinds of things that I hope that we will be able to have more discussions about, not just us, but other people who maybe are also interested in the Dungans, thinking about the Dungans, maybe writing about them. That we will have more of these kinds of conversations. Yeah, but thank you so very much. I appreciate your question very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And for your answer. It was wonderful. Thank you.
And next we have Don.
Hello. Thank you
Oh,
so.
Michael.
Yeah. I'm sorry. That was a little. That was kind of funny. How you said my name. Anyways,
How
my
do you
question.
say your name? Did I say it wrong?
Yeah, it's my Chinese name. It's Dongfang.
Dongfang, I'm sorry. I
No,
only know
it's
you as
fine.
Michael.
It's all fine. First of all, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come talk to us. I wanted to ask, how do you think John's background, given he is half Russian, as well as not being able to speak the Dungan language. How do you think that background has affected his ability to write about and like faithfully capture the Dungan ethnography, especially in the chapter about his own short stories, especially the one about the bicycle. I wonder how his background is able to fully capture that of a Dunganese boy.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Um, yeah, no, yeah. So Dzhon is very interesting as an individual for many reasons, and one of them is his sort of is the fact that he, in fact, I later discovered, actually had a Russian mother. I actually didn't realize that till I was requesting photographs that I might include later on in my project, more towards the publication stage, as we got closer. And I was sort of surprised to see that he had a Russian mother. Um, but then again, I realized that, his identity, right? Ultimately, it has to do with identity, and he identifies fully as a Dungan. And he had never said otherwise, even the many years that we had sort of communicated up to the time that I think he had sent me the photograph, which was later in that, I believe, like 7-8 year period that I was working on the project. Um, so, but there were practical sort of implications of this too, because his mother was an ethnic Russian. Dungan was not spoken in the household. Correct, you see? So it was really only Russian. So he grew up really only using Russian, from what I understand. But he grew up in Dungan sort of communities in Kazakhstan and later Kyrgyzstan. So from there, he did have some exposure, though, right, to the Dungan people who were using, right, Dungan language. And he has always identified as a Dungan himself, right? So in terms of his faithfulness in capturing sort of that you mentioned, the sort of Dungan experience, I think that he, because of his sort of the fact that he's really spent, most of his life in the Dungan communities, first in Kazakhstan and until now really in Kyrgyzstan, that it is quite faithful, if you will, in that sense. And because of his early sort of academic interest, for example, in history, he's a candidate of sciences in history, and then later moved into ethnography, being with a focus also on the Dungan people that were around him. I think it also, I think it is quite interesting, but also quite reliable, and also quite faithful in that sense. So, and in terms of the ethnography, as I sort of mentioned earlier, in terms of anthropology, the usual paradigm, in fact, would be somebody like an outsider sort of writing about somebody else, correct? In terms of sort of not having any bias about the people that you're sort of writing about. If you're the traditional way of looking at it. So Dzhon in a sense is one of the ones that's challenging that by sort of being a Dungan himself, who's sort of writing about his own people. And I think, and there, of course, there's acknowledgement now also within the anthropological community, and which I think is also well taken, that there is much to be learned from that as well, right? If the studies are being carried out in a certain way, and there are certain disclaimers about the work that the scientific work that you are doing, right? And then with Dzhon, it's this even more just really sort of fascinating aspect that in addition to the really great output of scientific work is the literary sort of output that he's produced. In particular, the two substantial collections of Russian language poetry. And all of those poems are actually in my English language collection. And, in addition to the short stories that came out in other places, for example, the Dungan newspaper. I think those are such interesting pieces to read, for example, as a lay person, just as literature, but also so very valuable also from a anthropological scientific perspective in terms of what that reveals also about the Dungan people through the eyes of one of their own. I think it's extremely unusual and just absolutely fascinating. And I hope readers will feel that too. Yeah. But thank you so much for your questions. They're absolutely wonderful questions, very thought-provoking.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kenneth, I agree. The questions have been really awesome. And we have time for one more from Dzhon.
Thank you. Hi, Dr. Yin. Thank you for the discussion. It was super interesting. So my question is, it might be a little similar to the previous ones, but so illiteracy was prevalent in minorities through history, and you talked about this a little with regards to the Dungans. So would you say that Dzhon's work, even though it represents a Dungan perspective, is written for or like is intended towards an outsider or foreign audience as opposed to a Dungan audience? And also, like, is his work known or rather popular within the Dungan community?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you so much for the question. So the first part of the question, Dzhon actually, and I think I write about this in the preface or the introduction to the English language edition. Dzhon, when he wrote the poetry and his even the short pieces of prose, told me very clearly that he actually never intended for them to sort of go out beyond beyond the local sort of community, if you will. So, the Dungan community, the people sort of in Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan. So he was very flattered, in fact, he told me, and very humbled by the fact that I, as a sort of, Western scholar, was not just interested, in having his Russian language creative writings, to read, but also to publish them, to bring them to a wider sort of audience. Yeah. And then in terms of, he said that the times that he would write, particularly the poetry, was times when he felt this sort of inner urge to do so. It wasn't something that was scheduled. It wasn't something that he could predict. But it would sort of come from within. And he would just feel this need to have to put it sort of on paper. And so it really seems to be ultimately it was for himself. And he perhaps expected, would distribute it to friends, family, friends, and local sort of people, but never really thought that it would appear in the English edition that it has appeared in, but is very, very flattered and very pleased and excited that has happened. Yeah, and he is he's extremely well known and well respected within the Dungan community. He's he's the best known Dungan ethnographer, as I already mentioned, and he's been working for many years as an ethnographer, has published more than 50 scholarly works, right, on the Dungans mainly. And he is also known by many for these creative works, like poetry in particular that I've translated, but also for some of his short fiction, because they appear now on his own social media, ok.ru, Одноклассники, the classmates, those are social media, as well as on the Dungan newspaper, Facebook, as well as the Dungan website, the website of the Dungan Cultural Center of Kyrgyzstan. Actually, one of his short stories that I translate into English appeared recently in Dungan on that particular website. Somebody translated from Russian into Dungan. So he's extremely well known in the Dungan community, and I'm hoping with my writing about him and talking about him that he will become better known within a more global sort of community. English language speakers as well as perhaps Russian language speakers who also learn about his work through hearing me proselytize about him and talk about him, and just what important and just fascinating work that Dzhon has done. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the question.
Well, Kenneth, with that, I think our time is up. So thanks so much again for a wonderful presentation.